Dawn over the eastern plateau came without ceremony. A line of orange splitting the dark above the Zagros, slowly enough that a man watching it could pretend he had more time than he did. Kambiz had been at the targets since the 4th hour before sunrise. His quiver was 3/4 empty. The arrows he'd already fired stood in the targets at distances that would have seemed impossible to a Roman, to a Greek, to anyone who hadn't spent his entire life learning that the body and the bow are one instrument. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't spoken to anyone. He reached back, drew, and released. The sound the arrow made was almost apologetic. A whisper, then nothing. Then a thud at 240 paces that the morning air carried back to him clearly. What no one watching him would have guessed, had anyone been watching, was that Kambiz hadn't slept in 3 nights. Not from battle nerves. Kambiz didn't get battle nerves. He'd ridden in 6 engagements, 2 full campaigns, 1 siege. His hands were steady in the cold. His breathing was the slow, deliberate breathing of a man who had made peace, years ago, with the possibility of dying. No. The thing keeping him awake was smaller than battle. It always is. This is a story about a battle that changed the ancient world, and about the man whose divided heart helped win it, and cost it at the same time. The Battle of Carrhae. 53 years before the Common Era. Rome's worst military disaster since Cannae. And at the center of it, not a general's pride, not a king's ambition, but a Parthian archer who couldn't stop thinking about a woman who wove red thread into grey cloth, and the letter she'd pressed into a courier's hand the week before the army moved out. The palace textile workshops occupied the ground floor of the North Wing. Practical, unglamorous, kept warm in winter by the looms themselves and the bodies of the women who worked there. Kambiz had no business being there. He'd gone twice in 4 months, on pretexts so thin they'd embarrassed him. A message for the supply quartermaster, a question about horse blankets. Atia worked the 3rd loom from the left. She was from the Saka territories, east of the empire's proper borders, and she moved through Ctesiphon with the particular composure of someone who has already survived leaving everything behind once. She was shorter than Kambiz by half a head. Her hands were always stained faintly blue from the dyeing work. When she laughed, which wasn't often, because the workshop was loud and laughter needed room, she put her hand over her mouth first, as if the sound surprised her too. Kambiz had told himself precisely 412 times, he'd counted, that this was nothing. That desire was a Roman luxury, a Greek indulgence, the kind of feeling that belonged in one of the Persian court love poems that the Surena read for amusement and the soldiers privately memorized. He was a cavalry captain. He had an oath. He had the battle coming. He had 20 triple-fletched arrows he'd made himself, the 3rd feather on each one cut to a precise angle that held the others true.
The 3rd feather is the one that holds the others true. Without it, the arrow drifts.
He'd said that to Mazda once, explaining why he made his own arrows instead of drawing from the arsenal. Mazda had looked at him for a moment longer than necessary, in the way Mazda always did, and then gone back to his grinding wheel without responding. The Surena's war briefing was held in the evening when the day's heat dropped enough to think clearly. Mirdad of the Surene clan, the Surena, was 30 years old and already the finest general in the Arsacid Empire, possibly in the world. He had the kind of physical stillness that made you feel like the room had rearranged itself around him when he walked in. He unrolled the campaign map across the silk carpet and spoke without preamble.
7 legions, 43,000 men. Crassus has crossed the Euphrates and is marching southeast. He believes this is a trade war, that if he takes enough ground, Parthia will negotiate. He is wrong on 2 counts.
He tapped the flat plain marked on the map. east of the river Balisus.
He believes we fight like Greeks. We don't. He believes the terrain here is neutral. It isn't. Open ground is a killing field for horse archers and a graveyard for infantry squares. Crassus wants the hills. We will make sure he never reaches them.
Kambiz stood at attention through the full briefing. The Serena laid out the plan with the economy of someone who had already run this in his mind 100 times and was now simply telling the others what was true. 10,000 horse archers, a smaller force of heavy cavalry for the decisive blow, the camels carrying the replacement arrows, enough to maintain continuous fire for a full day. No retreating, no breaking formation. The Parthian shot, the turn and fire backward technique that Romans could never adequately explain to their generals because seeing it described was nothing like being on the receiving end of it. Kambiz absorbed all of this. He was good at absorbing information. He was good at most things that required control. Shahram, the first captain, stood across the map from him. Shahram had a crescent-shaped scar on his right hand. Old, pale, the kind of scar that doesn't pull anymore. Kambiz had noticed it years ago and never asked. In 20 years of service to the Serena, Shahram had never mentioned a family. Not a wife, not children, not a mother. Nothing. He existed, as far as anyone could observe, entirely as a soldier. Shahram caught Kambiz's eye across the map, said nothing, looked away. After the briefing, Kambiz went to Mazda's workshop. Mazda's place was half underground. You descended 4 stone steps, and the temperature dropped immediately, and the smell of pine pitch and iron filings hit you before your eyes adjusted. Mazda was old. Not old enough to have served Mirdad's father, but close. He repaired bows, fletched arrows, and knew more secrets than the palace intelligence service, because people trusted craftsmen in a way they'd never trust a spy. Mazda reached beneath his workbench and produced a small rectangle of undyed linen, folded 4 times, sealed at the fold with a drop of blue wax. He set it on the workbench between them without expression. Kambiz looked at it for 3 full seconds without moving. Mazda looked at the folded cloth, looked at Kambiz. Kambiz climbed back up the 4 stone steps into the night air. The city was quiet around him. In 4 days, the army would move. He told himself he'd read it after the campaign. That was the rational choice. That was what a disciplined man did. He kept his worlds separate, each in its proper order, each undisturbed by the other. The blue wax seal held. The linen stayed folded. And somewhere across the desert, Marcus Licinius Crassus was counting the days until he reached the hills that Kambiz knew he'd never find. The thing about a letter is that its desire made material. You can suppress a feeling. It stays in the body, manageable. A pressure, an ache, something you can work around. But the moment you write it down, it exists outside you. It has weight. It can be carried. It can be lost. It can be found. Kambiz hadn't written his reply himself. He had Atia write it to avoid the paper trail of a cavalry captain visiting the workshop. He dictated it to her through the supply quartermaster's errand boy on the morning before the army marched, whispering the words into the boy's ear, section by section. He'd meant to keep it simple. He meant to write something cold, something that sounded like a soldier's brief acknowledgement. Nothing actionable, nothing that could be used. He didn't keep it simple. What he actually sent, what he dictated before he could stop himself, was 3 paragraphs. The first described the archery plateau at dawn, because it was the thing he'd thought about telling her for 4 months, and he had always had more control over his silence than his feelings. The second described the cavalry's formation plan for the opening of the battle. Not deliberately, but because he'd spent 3 weeks internalizing it, and it came out in the language of explaining delay. I cannot come to you before the eastern wing sets its arc and the camels take the second position, which won't be until the 4th day of engagement, and by then... He described the entire Parthian cavalry disposition in the language of a man explaining why he couldn't leave. Pharnaces, the intelligence officer, had intercepted it at the city gate. Not specifically looking for it, just doing his job, opening anything that moved between the textile workshop and anyone attached to the military. He'd read it in 4 minutes. He'd seen the tactical information immediately. He could have brought it to the Sirena. That would have been protocol. Instead, Pharnaces folded the letter, tucked it inside his boot, and went to find Shahram. Because Pharnaces owed Shahram a debt from the campaign 2 years prior, the kind of debt that can't be settled in silver. On the Roman side of the Balissus Ford, things were proceeding with the orderly confidence of a civilization that had never lost a major engagement in the East. Lucius Varro Crassus was 23 years old, his uncle's aide-de-camp, and profoundly aware that he was the least useful person in the Roman camp. He spoke passable Greek, reasonable Aramaic, and was learning Parthian from a captured merchant. He was not a soldier. He was the general's nephew, with a stylus and a talent for languages that Marcus Crassus found marginally useful for translating intelligence documents and thoroughly useless for everything else. The document reached him through the standard intelligence chain. Intercepted at the river crossing by a Parthian deserter who'd sold it to a Roman trader, who'd taken it to the centurion, who'd taken it to the legate, who'd taken it to the general, who'd handed it to Lucius with the words, "Translate this." He sat in the tent with a clay oil lamp and the papyrus and began to work through the Parthian script. The first paragraph he translated correctly. The archery plateau at dawn, the cold, the color of the light. Military adjacent, but not tactical. The second paragraph, the one describing the cavalry formation, the camel positions, the timing of the eastern wing. He translated correctly too. His Parthian was better than he'd admitted to Marcus. He got every word. Then he read the third paragraph. The third paragraph said, "When I think of you watching me from the workshop door that second time, pretending you were looking at the courtyard, I knew. I've known for months. I don't know how to say this in a letter that I'm telling a boy to memorize, which means this is absurd, which means I know how you laugh when you think no one is looking. Hand over the mouth first, like the sound surprises you." Lucius set the papyrus down. He picked up his stylus. He set the stylus down. He sat for a long time in the tent with the oil lamp and the letter and a tactical document that, if reported to his uncle, would have confirmed the Parthian cavalry disposition, validated Marcus Crassus's existing intelligence about the eastern wing, and possibly, changed the course of what was about to happen on the plain of Carrhae. He thought about the archer who wrote this. He thought about the woman who received it. He folded the papyrus and put it in the pocket of his tunic, next to his skin. He didn't write the tactical report. On the morning before the army moved, Shahram rode up beside Kambiz in the pre-dawn dark, where the horses were being saddled and the air tasted of iron and cold leather. He said nothing for a moment. He held a single piece of papyrus between 2 fingers, not the original, a copy made in Pharnaces' careful hand. He held it out. Kambiz's hand went still on the saddle strap. Kambiz took the copy. Read it. Read it again. The morning around them was entirely normal. Soldiers moving through torchlight, horses adjusting to their loads, the sound of 100 small preparations.
And Kambiz stood, holding a piece of papyrus, and feeling the ground tilt beneath him in a way that no battle had ever managed. Kambiz looked at Shahram. Shahram looked back. The scar on Shahram's right hand was white in the torchlight. Pale, old, from 20 years ago, and a choice that couldn't be undone. He turned his horse and walked it away through the dark. Kambiz stood with the papyrus until one of the grooms came to ask about the saddle check. He answered the groom. He finished the preparations. He told no one. The lie he'd always told himself. The discipline was the same as invulnerability. That a soldier who suppressed feeling was a soldier without weakness was still in his mouth. He swallowed it. He rode out. 2 hours later, the army crossed the Balisus, and Rome walked into the last morning it would ever spend in the East. There are battles that take hours to explain, and seconds to understand. Carrhae was one of them. The Romans emerged from the Balisus ford onto the plain, and immediately felt the wrongness of it. The wrongness their general wouldn't admit, because Marcus Licinius Crassus had wanted this campaign for years, and he'd already spent the money he expected to make from it. The flat ground stretched to every horizon. The sun was behind them for exactly the time it took to march 2 miles. And then it wasn't anymore. It was directly overhead, and the armored men in their iron scales and bronze fittings became their own furnaces. The dust cloud arrived before the Parthians did. It came from the east, a brown wall along the horizon, and the Roman scouts who rode out to look at it came back reporting 10,000, 20,000. They couldn't say. The dust was too thick, and the horsemen were moving fast enough that counting was impossible. The standard military response to that kind of intelligence was caution. Crassus responded to it with formation. His son Publius took the cavalry wing left. That was the first fatal mistake. The second fatal mistake was the square. Kambiz rode in the eastern company of the horse archers, 200 men whose job was to hold the arc of the encirclement and not let the Roman infantry reform their square once it began to stretch. He'd done this in exercises. He'd done this in smaller engagements. His hands on the reins, and his back, and his breathing were all exactly right. His mind was in 2 places at once, not 50-50. He wasn't that gone. More like 90 and 10, with the 10 being a constant low-frequency noise underneath the 90. Like a crack in a bell that you can only hear when everything else goes quiet. He kept seeing Shahram's face in the torchlight. The scar. The papyrus.
The Romans found your letter.
The Parthian archers began their first pass. The sound of 10,000 bows releasing in near unison is not a sound that has a modern equivalent. It's part music and part catastrophe. A sustained hiss, followed by the impact sound of iron bodkins against Roman shields, which is something between a hammer striking stone and a wave breaking on a beach. Except the wave keeps coming, and the stone is a man. The Romans formed the testudo,
The tortoise formation, shields overlapping overhead. Smart, trained, correct, and futile against what Carrhae was, which was not a battle, but a consumption. The archers didn't need to penetrate the shields. They needed to exhaust the men inside them, drive them to sweat out their water supply in full-body iron in a Mesopotamian summer until raising the shield became physiologically impossible. Shahram rode 20 paces off Kambiz's left shoulder throughout the morning. Not beside him, not speaking to him. Just present, in the peripheral of Kambiz's vision, where peripheral things live until they're not peripheral anymore. The signal to close the encirclement was Kambiz's to give. That was his role. When the Surena's trumpet sounded 3 times, Kambiz's company would push the eastern arc inward, collapsing the Roman square's right flank while the heavy cavalry drove through the gap. Timing was everything. Early was useless. Late was catastrophe. The trumpet sounded. Kambiz raised his arm. For 2 seconds. 2 seconds in the space between the trumpet's third note and his own signal arm dropping. He saw Atiya's face. Not her face on the plain. Not a vision. Just the memory of her in the workshop. The light coming through the high slat windows in bars across the floor. Her hand going to her mouth before she laughed. 2 seconds of absolute involuntary human presence in the middle of a battle. Then his arm came down. The company surged forward. 2 seconds late. The Roman right flank, which should have been caught mid-turn and destroyed, had 2 more seconds to reform. The gap was narrower than planned. The heavy cavalry still punched through. The Surena's genius was greater than a 2-second delay. But the cost was counted in Parthian dead on the eastern arc. Men who had to push harder and longer than they should have, because the right moment had slipped by the width of a woman's laugh. The battle took the rest of the day. Marcus Licinius Crassus spent it in the center of a shrinking perimeter, watching his army dissolve around him. His son Publius died on the cavalry charge. Another fatal mistake. Riding too far, too fast, with too few men. Crassus retreated to the town of Carrhae that night with the remnants of what had been Rome's finest eastern force. He negotiated. The negotiations failed. He fell. Not in battle, which he'd wanted, but in the aftermath, which no one chooses. Crassus had come east to write himself into the same sentence as Pompey and Caesar. He got a different sentence. Shorter. Final. The killing plain, in the evening light, looked like a textile after it's been half unraveled. Colors still present, structure gone, threads going everywhere and nowhere. Kambiz walked it on foot after the heavy work was done, reins in hand, his horse following him at a walk. He was counting his remaining arrows the way he always counted. 3. 3 left from 20. 17 fired. All of them true. The third feather had held. He nearly walked past the Roman. But the Roman said something. The young man was seated with his back against a broken Roman cartwheel, his armor half removed, clearly an aide rather than a fighting soldier. No blood on him, or anyway, not his own. He looked at Kambiz coming through the dust and said in Parthian that was clearly recent but not terrible, Kambiz stopped. He looked at the Roman. The Roman was young, maybe 23, 24. He had the look of someone who had just watched something enormous happen and was not yet sure whether surviving it was the right outcome. Before we go further, if you want to know what the plain of Carrhae looked like from the ground, what actually happened to Crassus in that final negotiation, and who carried his head back to the Parthian court, make sure you're subscribed. This channel doesn't look away from what history actually was. Come back for it.
Kambiz stood with 3 arrows in his quiver and 17 in the sand around him, and the entire battlefield of Carrhae at his back. And he looked at this Roman boy who had held a piece of papyrus next to his skin all through the campaign and chosen not to weaponize it.
He thought about the 2-second hesitation. He thought about the men on the Eastern Arc who had paid for it.
The truth that was assembling itself at the back of his mind was not a comfortable truth. It was the truth that the lie doesn't protect anyone.
That what he'd called discipline had been fear wearing discipline's clothes. And when the fear broke through anyway, at the worst possible moment, in the form of 2 seconds of involuntary love, it had cost exactly what he'd always promised himself the love would cost. The Roman hadn't weaponized desire. And somehow, the battle was still won.
Kambiz looked at the 3 remaining arrows in his quiver, the 3rd feather intact on all of them. He crouched beside the Roman prisoner and said in Greek, Ctesiphon received its army the way cities receive armies. Noise and dust, and the particular relief of a population that had spent 3 weeks trying not to think about the worst possible outcome.
Garlands on the gates, children at the walls, the smell of roasting meat from the market quarter. Kambiz brought the Roman prisoner in with his own company. He'd given the young man a horse and a cloak and told him not to speak unless spoken to, which Lucius had managed reasonably well, despite clearly wanting to say a great many things.
Lucius, for his part, had spent the ride from Carrhae to Ctesiphon looking at everything with the attention of a man who was memorizing it, which Kambiz understood. He'd have done the same in Rome.
The Serena held the victory proceedings with appropriate ceremony. Awards, promotions, the formal accounting of the engagement. Kambiz stood through all of it at attention, which he was good at. He'd had practice.
He was counting the cracks in the plaster of the war room ceiling. Still 43, same as before. They didn't change. Things in the war room never changed.
Only the maps changed, and even those were rolled up and stored away to become history. He requested an audience with the Serena 2 days later. Private! The Serena granted it without asking why, which told Kambiz that the Serena already had some version of the story from Sharam or Pharnaces and was waiting to hear Kambiz's version.
Kambiz told him everything. The letter, the tactical information he'd inadvertently included, Pharnaces' intercept, Sharam's confrontation, the 2-second hesitation on the signal.
He said it the way you say things you've been carrying too long. Plainly, without inflection, because the weight of it has already compressed the feeling out, and what's left is just the shape of what happened.
The Serena listened without interrupting. When Kambiz finished, there was a long silence, and then the Serena looked at him for a long moment.
Kambiz left the audience with nothing resolved and everything clarified, which is not comfortable, but is, the Serena believed, the only honest outcome of a real accounting. Sharam found him in the corridor outside. The scar on his right hand was visible in the afternoon light. Pale, old,
the shape of a choice that had been made a long time ago and lived with ever since. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Shahram looked at the wall for a moment. Then, in a voice that was nothing like his military voice, quieter, from somewhere older, Kambiz looked at him, at the scar, at the 20 years of hollow discipline that Shahram wore like a second uniform. He nodded once. There wasn't anything to say. Some truths arrive too late to be useful and still need to be spoken. Lucius Varro was held in comfortable captivity in the palace guest quarters, which was awkward for everyone but not unpleasant. Kambiz brought in the letter. The original papyrus, which Lucius had kept in his tunic all the way to Ctesiphon with the same strange protectiveness. Lucius held the papyrus for a moment, then set it carefully on the table between them. Kambiz looked at the young Roman. This man who had made a choice that had bent the shape of history, not out of strategy or loyalty or political calculation, but because he'd read 3 paragraphs and recognized something human in them that he couldn't reduce to a tactical report. A Roman, 23 years old, sitting in enemy captivity with a letter that wasn't his, which he'd kept because it deserved to be kept. Kambiz went to the textile workshop that afternoon. The north wing was quiet in the afternoon. The workers took a meal break at the 3rd hour past noon, and the looms stood idle. He'd never been in the workshop when it was empty. The loom was still there. Atia's loom, 3rd from the left. The shuttle was stopped mid-row. The warp threads ran grey and ochre, top to bottom, and through the heddle ran the red thread. The last one she always saved, the one she put in last. The thread was still there, threaded through and waiting. The row was half done. She'd left before the army returned. He'd known, somewhere, that she would. Not from lack of feeling, from too much of it, the same way he'd suppressed his own. She wouldn't wait at the workshop door like a supplicant. She wasn't that. She was someone who had already survived leaving everything behind once, and she'd done it again, cleanly, not knowing whether he was alive. Kambiz stood at the loom for a long time. The 3rd feather holds the others true. Without it, the arrow drifts. He'd spent years believing he could pull the 3rd feather out and still fly straight. That was the lie. Not that desire was wrong. Desire was the feather, not the weakness. The lie was that he could remove part of himself and still be whole. He reached out and touched the stopped red thread with one finger. It was still slightly tense under the warp. She'd left it mid-tension, mid-row, the way you leave a sentence you mean to finish. He didn't follow her. Not because duty stopped him, but because he didn't know where she'd gone.
And chasing someone who has chosen to leave is not love. It's demand. Whatever he owed her now was different from what he'd withheld. He owed her his honesty. The honest thing was to stay and find her through proper means, not to arrive breathless and claiming everything he denied when she was close enough to touch. Mazda found him there an hour later, standing at the stopped loom. Kambiz looked at the old armorer, at the workshop around them, the looms, the dyeing basins, the bars of afternoon light falling through the high slat windows exactly the way they always did. The smell of wool and sizing. The Battle of Carrhae was over. Marcus Crassus was dead on the eastern plain. Not the death he'd wanted, but the one he'd built for himself, brick by brick, with every assumption he'd refused to examine. His dream of eastern glory ended in dust and flat ground, and the realization that the people he'd called barbarians had understood something about war that Rome, for all its legions, had not. Lucius Varro was ransomed 18 months later through a quiet diplomatic arrangement that suited everyone. He returned to Rome carrying very little of what he'd brought east, except a working knowledge of Parthian and the particular careful quality of someone who has watched something enormous and taken the right lesson from it, which is a rarer homecoming than it sounds. Kambiz sent a message east on the trade road 3 weeks after the battle. Not a letter. He'd learned something about letters. A small object. One of his remaining triple-fletched arrows, the third feather intact. No note. Just the arrow. The courier who carried it confirmed delivery. Later. Said the woman who received it held it for a long time before she said anything. Said what she said when she finally spoke was, "He knows." The loom in the workshop was taken over by someone else eventually. The red thread finished by another hand. The pattern completed by someone who never knew what had stopped it or why. The cloth was sold, cut apart, used for something ordinary and practical, the way good cloth usually is. On the eastern trade road, somewhere past the empire's edge, a woman who had blue-stained hands and laughed with her hand over her mouth waited for the seasons to turn. And in the palace of Ctesiphon, a cavalry captain stood at his practice range in the early light, drew, and released. The arrow flew straight, all 3 feathers, holding. Duty and desire are not the enemies of each other. They are the argument that makes a person whole. Kambiz learned this the way most people learn the important things. Through the specific, irreversible cost of believing otherwise. Crassus wanted an empire. He got a plain. The Serena wanted a clean victory. He got one, with a 2-second crack in it that no one would write into the official record. Sharam wanted proof that duty without feeling was survivable. He got his proof. He didn't enjoy it. Kambiz wanted to keep his world separate. He couldn't. And in the end, the world that broke through wasn't the one that destroyed him. It was the one that, in the hands of a young Roman who couldn't reduce love to intelligence, quietly saved the battle he'd spent his whole career preparing to fight. The arrow flies true with 3 feathers. The archer is the same. If this story landed the way it was meant to, if you felt Kambiz at that loom, Lucius holding the stylus, the 2 seconds on the plane, subscribe to this channel. These are the stories history remembers wrong, told the way they actually went. New ones every week. Don't miss the next.